Okay, so you want to picture the worst catastrophe in European history. Between 1347 and 1351, a plague arrived on trading ships and killed somewhere between a third and 60% of the population, depending on the region. Whole villages disappeared. Priests ran out of Latin to bury the dead in, so bodies went into pits without ceremony. You think about the horror, the corpses stacked in Florence, the empty monasteries, the sheer scale of a continent watching itself die. Very few people think about what happened to the survivors' paychecks. Here is the number that puts all of it in perspective. Within 2 generations of the plague, ordinary laborers in England were earning roughly double what their grandparents had earned, measured in real purchasing power. And this wasn't a temporary spike. It held for over a century. That is not a footnote, that is the whole story compressed into one number. So here is the question nobody asks cleanly. How does the single deadliest event in medieval history end up raising living standards for the people who survived it? The answer is not what most people expect, and once you understand it, you will never look at a population collapse the same way again. It starts with a plot of land in rural England, too small to feed the family farming it, because there were simply too many families, and not enough land to go around. To understand why the plague made anyone richer, you first need to understand how poor Europe already was. By the early 1300s, the population had been climbing for 3 centuries, and it had finally outrun the food supply. Farms in England, France, and much of Western Europe had been subdivided again and again across generations of inheritance, until many peasant households were working plots too small to feed themselves through a bad harvest. Marginal land, the rocky hillsides and thin soils nobody would have bothered farming a century earlier, was under the plow because there was nowhere else to put people. Between 1315 and 1317, a run of catastrophic weather triggered the Great Famine, and contemporary chroniclers described parents unable to feed their children and the price of grain in some markets rising to nearly 4 times its normal level. This was not a plague. This was simple arithmetic. Too many mouths, not enough land, and a food system with no slack left in it. Economists have a name for the trap Europe was stuck in, a Malthusian equilibrium, where any gain in productivity gets absorbed by population growth until wages fall back to bare subsistence. Land was the scarce resource, so landowners held all the leverage. A peasant with no land had no bargaining power at all, because there were always 3 more families willing to take his place on whatever terms the Lord offered. Real wages for unskilled labor in the decades before the plague were near their lowest point in recorded English history. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as a labor surplus economy is supposed to work, and that was precisely the problem. Then the mortality hit, and it hit the labor supply, not the land supply. Fields didn't die of plague. Barns didn't catch it. Only people did, and somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the workforce across much of Europe was gone within 4 years. Overnight, the ratio that had defined the medieval economy flipped. Land, which had been the scarce resource, was suddenly abundant because there was nobody left to farm large stretches of it. Labor, which had been abundant to the point of worthlessness, was suddenly the scarcest thing in the economy. Let's run the actual numbers, because they are almost impossible to reconcile with the image of the plague as pure disaster. In England, the daily wage of an agricultural laborer roughly doubled between the 1340s and the 1450s, once you adjust for the price of food and other goods, according to the Wage and Price series economic historians have reconstructed from manorial account books and probate records. A thatcher or a plowman who could barely feed his family before 1347 could, by the early 1400s, afford meat several times a week, better ale, and finer cloth, purchases that would have been unthinkable luxuries for someone of his station a century earlier. Contemporary writers noticed and complained about it constantly. English clergy grumbled that peasants were dressing above their station, that laborers demanded to be paid in coin rather than food and lodging, and that servants would simply walk off one estate to take a better wage at the next, something that had been almost impossible when there were 10 workers for every open position. Landowners tried to legislate their way out of it. In 1351, the English Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers, an attempt to freeze wages at pre-plague levels by law, and to criminalize workers who left one employer for a better offer elsewhere. Read that again. The ruling class had to pass a national law specifically because market wages were rising faster than they could stomach. The statute was a near total failure. Wages kept climbing anyway, because there was no enforcement mechanism strong enough to override a labor market where every lord in the county was quietly bidding against his neighbors for the same shrinking pool of workers. Land rents told the same story in reverse. With so many tenants dead and so much farmland empty, lords who wanted their fields worked at all had to cut rents, offer better lease terms, and in many cases release peasants from traditional labor obligations entirely just to keep them from moving to a neighboring estate with a better deal. But the gains were not universal, and here's the part that most retellings skip. The exact same shock that raised wages in England and the Low Countries pushed Eastern Europe in the opposite direction. In Poland, Bohemia, and the lands east of the Elbe, landowners responded to the same labor shortage not by competing for workers with better terms, but by tightening legal control over the peasants who remained, binding them more firmly to the land, and expanding serfdom rather than dismantling it. Historians call this divergence the Little Divergence, and it split the continent along a line that would shape European economic development for the next 400 years. The difference wasn't the disease. The disease was identical. The difference was which direction landlords could legally push when they lost their leverage, and in the East, weaker towns and weaker peasant institutions meant lords still had the power to write the new rules themselves. Even within Western Europe, the transition from crisis to prosperity was not smooth, and the people paying the sharpest price were the ones the old system depended on most. English lords who could not legally force wages down resented every penny they were losing to workers they had once controlled outright, and that resentment did not stay quiet. On June 13th, laborers, and townspeople, furious over a regressive poll tax stacked on top of decades of failed attempts to suppress their wages, marched into London, opened the prisons, and executed the Archbishop of Canterbury on Tower Hill. The peasants' revolt was crushed within weeks, and its leaders were killed. But the underlying arithmetic that provoked it did not go away. English lords never successfully reimposed the old wage controls. The rebellion failed as an uprising, and succeeded as a market signal. The price of labor was not going back down, no matter how many statutes said otherwise. What came after the revolt was not really a collapse. It was a quiet reorganization of the entire economy around the new scarcity. Grain farming, which needed enormous amounts of cheap labor to be profitable, became far less attractive once labor was expensive. Sheep farming needed a fraction of the workers per acre, so vast stretches of English farmland were converted to pasture over the following century, feeding a wool export trade that would eventually fund England's rise as a commercial power. Serfdom in Western Europe, already weakened by the plague, effectively dissolved over the following century, replaced by wage labor and fixed-rent tenancy, because lords no longer had the leverage to enforce the old obligations. Survivors inherited land and capital that would once have been split among 3 or 4 siblings, concentrating wealth in fewer hands and accelerating investment in labor-saving tools, since a farmer who could no longer hire cheap hands had every incentive to buy a better plow instead. The demographic catastrophe of the 14th century produced, by the 15th, an economy with higher wages, cheaper land, and stronger incentives to mechanize than Europe had ever seen before. The system that replaced feudal labor obligations was not obviously kinder. It simply ran on wages and rent instead of custom and coercion, and that shift, for all its benefits, also planted the first seeds of the wage-dependent, landless workforce that industrial capitalism would later exploit in its own way. So here is the honest ledger. On the asset side, real wages for ordinary workers roughly doubled across much of Western Europe. Land became cheap and abundant. Serfdom collapsed as a legal institution, and the labor scarcity created lasting pressure toward mechanization and higher productivity per worker. On the liability side, it took the deaths of tens of millions of people to get there. The gains split the continent into a wealthier West and a more coercive East for centuries, and the peasants who forced the new terms into existence were doing so against landlords who fought them with law, prisons, and eventually the executioner. The Black Death was not an accident that happened to produce prosperity. It was an extreme demonstration of an ordinary economic principle. When the ratio between labor and land shifts, so does every wage, rent, and legal obligation built on top of it, whether anyone intends that outcome or not. Each lord who cut a peasant's rent in 1360 wasn't being generous. He was responding rationally to a labor market that had turned against him, and every peasant who walked off an estate for better terms elsewhere was doing the same. Nobody planned the wage gains. The incentives produced them anyway. So the next time you hear that automation or outsourcing or any structural shock is going to reshape who holds leverage in the labor market, you are not looking at something new. You are looking at something very, very old, running on the same logic that reshaped Europe after 1350. The Black Death proved the concept in the cruelest possible experiment. What does it take, in your own economy, for that same shift in leverage to happen without the plague?